Hey heroes, welcome to another amazing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. You know the drill. If you want to vote in monthly polls that help determine what I talk about over here, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with Twitter, Twitch, and all that stuff. Over the years, Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, has consistently been one of the most notorious and noteworthy crime lords in the Marvel Universe. But before he built his empire, and before the name of the Kingpin was whispered in hushed tones, he led a band of petty criminals by the time that he was 15, in fact. According to some sources, he had been a criminal leader for about a decade when he first met the woman who would be his wife, meaning that he would have been in his early to mid-20s. She, however, was apparently still a teenager, around 15 at the time. Little is known of her past, but apparently she was a lost amnesiac girl who was found by Fisk's underlings, who brought her before him not as a person but as property to be traded. But a lonely Wilson was smitten and wanted her for himself. She apparently fell for him as well, and sometime thereafter the two were married, but if we do take multiple sources into account, she may very well have still been a minor at the time. In any event, about a year after that, she gave birth to their only son, Richard Fisk. As Richard grew up, Vanessa attempted to shield him from Wilson's life of crime. However, he did bear witness to his father's savage acts of brutality at least once. This was something he held in common with his friend, Sammy Silk, whose father was an associate of Fisk's. Furthermore, Wilson was on at least one occasion abusive towards Richard, chiding his son for being a pathetic embarrassment. It's possible that Richard went into denial about this kind of thing, and as he became a young man, Vanessa sent him away to attend a private school in the Swiss Alps. It was there that he first met Alfredo Morelli, a boy who would become one of his closest friends. Despite his childhood, Richard still seemed to love and idolize his father during this time. He studied and trained, hoping to someday earn the respect of the esteemed Wilson Fisk, whose illicit activities were unknown to the public. However, it was only a matter of time before Fisk was exposed as the kingpin of crime, shattering any reverence Richard had for him. He left a suicide note to his father and disappeared into the mountains, leaving the world to believe that Richard Fisk was dead. The Kingpin was in denial over this and initially tried to hide it from Vanessa, but the news soon reached her regardless. Meanwhile, Richard plotted against his father and forged a false identity for himself. Using a prosthetic mask to alter his appearance and money from his parents that he'd squirreled away, he forged a criminal organization of his own. Calling himself the Schemer, his primary goal was to take over his father's organization, but this also led to clashes with the superhuman vigilante Spider-Man. A physical altercation between the two crime lords was broken up by Vanessa, who suspected the Schemer's true identity after looking into his eyes. In the end, Richard unmasked himself and confessed his schemes to his father. Wilson was so taken aback by his son's betrayal that he fell into a state of shock and was rendered virtually catatonic. Seeing that left Richard remorseful and realized that he still loved his father on some level. He and Vanessa sent Wilson to an institution to recover, but conventional treatments proved ineffective. Meanwhile, Richard joined a faction of the terrorist organization Hydra operating out of Las Vegas. He soon proved his cunning and resourcefulness, and within a year had attained the rank of Supreme Hydra. With their resources at his disposal, he developed a hypershock treatment to revive his father. Richard then allowed Wilson to assume control of that Hydra cell, using his own rank to act as a figurehead. During this time, their best enforcer was Aaron Nicholson, a man who was seemingly able to find a solution to any problem they had. Nicholson volunteered to be used as a test subject when the Fisks attempted to use technology created by the deceased scientist Harlan Stillwell in an attempt to endow their agents with superpowers. The process seemed to have no effect on him and was deemed a failure, but Nicholson remained in Wilson Fisk's employ. Meanwhile, it eventually came to light that the Fisk's Hydra cell was secretly being controlled by the notorious Nazi supervillain, the Red Skull. His ultimate goal was the foundation of the Fourth Reich, which even the Kingpin opposed. And so when the Red Skull unleashed a dormant Nazi weapon called a Sleeper, the two Fisks allied with Captain America and the Falcon to stop it. In that battle, Richard was fatally wounded, but Wilson placed him into suspended animation until he could be revived. This was later accomplished when the Kingpin captured Spider-Man and drained a portion of his life essence, transferring it to Richard. Naturally, that whole thing led to another confrontation between Spider-Man and the Kingpin. While the hero was able to reclaim his stolen energy, it had already healed Richard's body, allowing him to recover on his own. An exhausted Richard retired to a summer home in the Hamptons with his old college friend Alfredo Morelli. It was there that he met Ned Leeds, an investigative journalist working for the Daily Bugle newspaper. Ned, of course, had come to ask questions about the Kingpin, and while Richard had no love for his father's empire, he no longer wanted to get involved. Instead, Richard spent his days jet-setting with Alfredo and spending his father's money. But Ned was relentless and pursued the two men wherever they went. Meanwhile, Vanessa had finally had enough and declared that if Wilson didn't leave his life of crime, she would leave him. She convinced him to make a deal with the authorities, turning over evidence to incriminate his lieutenants, allowing the Fisks to escape scot-free. But before any such transaction could be completed, those same lieutenants captured Vanessa, holding her hostage in exchange for the evidence. Wilson attempted to save her himself, but one of his aides fired a mortar, hoping that Vanessa's death would compel the Kingpin to return to crime. He certainly did, but Fisk quickly deduced who fired the shot and killed him with his bare hands. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to him, Vanessa had survived the explosion but fell into the sewers and was left amnesiac. She was eventually spotted by Bugle reporter Ben Urich and rescued by the masked vigilante Daredevil. Daredevil then used her as a bargaining chip, returning her to Fisk in exchange for his agent, Mayor-elect Randolph Cherry, resigning before taking office. Vanessa slipped in and out of lucidity for a while but was ultimately bedridden, left virtually comatose. And all of that is what convinced Richard Fisk that something must be done about his father. He and Alfredo finally met with Ned Leeds to discuss how best to proceed. Ned then brought Richard and Alfredo to a strange high-tech lab hidden in a normal warehouse where he told them something astonishing. Ned Leeds was secretly the supervillain known as the Hobgoblin, or at least he thought he was. The truth is a bit more complicated since Leeds had been brainwashed by the real Hobgoblin, Roderick Kingsley, to act as a stand-in. Unaware that he was being used as a pawn, Leeds helped Richard build a phony criminal empire. He used the Hobgoblin identity to intimidate rival gangsters, but also to gather intelligence that would help Richard's cause. Meanwhile, the Kingpin was paying a pair of crooked cops, Daniel Johnston and Abraham Varley, who regularly harassed Alfredo looking for information on Richard. However, Alfredo convinced them to leave the police force and work for him instead. Using their underworld connections, they helped provide Richard's organization with hired muscle. As for Richard himself, his role in all of this would need to remain completely anonymous, with only Ned and Alfredo knowing his true identity. And so he crafted the costumed persona of the Rose, a well-dressed criminal who wore glasses over a violet leather mask. He quickly built a small power base for himself, with his initial activities being somewhat less destructive than his father's, rigging sporting events and whatnot. However, his crime still eventually put him into conflict once again with Spider-Man. The Rose succeeded in infiltrating the Kingpin's empire, becoming a high-level mobster in his employ, all the while plotting against him. Meanwhile, do you remember that enforcer we mentioned earlier, Aaron Nicholson? He discovered that the experimental treatment he underwent endowed him with the ability to temporarily gain superpowers, such as enhanced strength or flight, but only in response to situations that required them. He thus became the costumed supervillain known as the Answer, and continued to serve as the Kingpin's trusted enforcer. The Kingpin subsequently had the Answer be the one to issue orders to the Rose rather than contacting him directly, much to Richard's annoyance. For example, the Answer tasked the Rose with setting up and overseeing the delivery of a shipment of heroin, essentially disproving the Kingpin's claims of not dealing in illicit substances. Unbeknownst to Richard, this was done to lure out the superhuman vigilante Dagger, who primarily targeted drug dealers alongside her partner Cloak. Initially, that was part of a larger scheme to transform the cyborg Magiadon Silvermane into an undead assassin, which is something we've talked about on the channel before. But the Answer also deduced that Dagger's light energy might hold the key to reviving Vanessa. The whole thing led to a battle involving Spider-Man, the Black Cat, Cloak and Dagger, Silvermane, and the Kingpin. In the end, the Answer sacrificed himself to re-energize Dagger, but she refused to restore Vanessa and instead escaped with Cloak. But anyway, Richard, Alfredo, and Ned continued plotting in secret to further their goals. Since nobody else knew of the connection between the Rose and the Hobgoblin, the two staged a meeting in front of Johnston and Varley, pretending to meet for the first time and forming a more public alliance. Their plans proceeded with the Rose acting as the brains of the organization, the Hobgoblin operating as his chief enforcer, and all the while Alfredo continued working behind the scenes using his espionage expertise to gather information. However, the Rose's alliance with the Hobgoblin is also where things started going wrong. Richard had no idea that the real Hobgoblin was Roderick Kingsley and that his friend Ned Leeds was being used as a pawn. As far as he could tell, Ned was becoming increasingly obsessed with gaining power and defeating Spider-Man. And so, much to his shame, in private, the Rose also began plotting the Hobgoblin's murder. He started relying on Ned less and Alfredo's espionage more, planting bugs in the Kingpin's tower to spy on his father. He learned that the Kingpin was growing increasingly obsessed with the masked vigilante Daredevil. His empire began to fracture, and his lieutenants started infighting in attempts to seize power. Meanwhile, Wilson conscripted an acclaimed psychotherapist, Dr. Paul Mondat, to treat Vanessa. He even abducted Mondat's wife Cheryl, hoping that holding her hostage would inspire the doctor to succeed. While Cheryl was rescued by Daredevil, Vanessa did recover enough to ask for her freedom and left for Europe. Wilson allowed this, but kept her under surveillance and subsequently learned of a plot to kill her. He abruptly left the country to deal with the would-be perpetrators while Vanessa was brought back to New York and kept sedated. In his absence, a gang war broke out across the city with multiple factions vying for control and vigilantes like the Punisher striking at everyone involved. At the middle of the conflict was an increasingly unhinged Ned Leeds. Kingsley used Ned to participate in the gang war by proxy, but repeated brainwashings made him more and more difficult to control. Meanwhile, the Kingpin's loyalists hired a mercenary known as the Jack-O-Lantern to protect their employer's interests. He briefly allied himself with the Hobgoblin during the gang war, but the two soon became bitter rivals. Richard continued operating as the Rose and also took time to visit his ailing mother, unaware of everything that she had been through. But he started to suspect something was amiss after her memory started to return. The man responsible for keeping her docile, Dr. Zakar, ushered Richard out of the room and scolded Vanessa for her lucidity, threatening to increase her medication. During this time, Richard also met a woman named Dina, and mutual attraction quickly led to a romance developing between them. She learned about his schemes to take down criminal organizations from the inside, but worried that he was becoming what he claimed to hate. Not long after that, a meeting with a rival gang went poorly and was interrupted by the police. With bullets flying from both sides, the Rose was shot in the arm and abandoned by the Hobgoblin. As the rain poured down, he tried to escape but was accosted by a single rookie cop. Unwilling to surrender, he fired on the young officer, intending on disarming him. However, the pain from his own wound flared up, and instead of striking the cop in the arm, he shot him in the neck, killing him. Richard fled the scene and returned to Dina, leaving both unsure of what to do. The gang war eventually came to an end when the Kingpin returned to reassert control. For what it's worth, while Dr. Zakar was instructed to keep Vanessa sedated, frightening and threatening her was a bridge too far, and he was executed for his impudence. Meanwhile, in order to keep Ned Leeds under control for a little longer, Kingsley allowed him to give information on the Rose's identity to the Kingpin in exchange for information on a story overseas that he wished to pursue as a journalist. The Kingpin agreed to the trade, despite the fact that he already knew who the Rose was. Sure enough, there was soon another showdown between the two when Richard confronted his father in Fisk Tower. Wilson explained that his return had been aided by the authorities who wished to end the gang war, and that he would be turning over his disloyal lieutenants to the police. Furthermore, with the threat on her life dealt with, Vanessa would be safely returned to her new home in Europe to continue her recovery. Meanwhile, as control over his pawn continued to slip, Kingsley decided that Ned Leeds had outlived his usefulness. Plotting to get rid of him, he leaked the fact that Ned was the Hobgoblin to several notable criminals. He also allowed Ned to investigate the lead that he'd gotten from the Kingpin and travel to Germany. Wishing to eliminate his more successful rival and usurp his position, Jason Macendale, the Jack-o'-lantern, hired a man known as the Foreigner who ran a company of assassins. And so, based on Kingsley's leaked information, the Foreigner's goons tracked Ned to Europe and murdered him. They also retrieved the Hobgoblin equipment that Kingsley had sent to Leeds and turned it over to Macendale, along with the locations of his secret hideouts. The former Jack-o'-lantern became the new Hobgoblin, and for a long time the general public was unaware of the switch. Key figures like Spider-Man and the Kingpin learned most of what had happened, but were tricked into believing that Leeds was the true original Hobgoblin. Kingsley retired from the role, his hand in everything that had happened having gone completely undetected. Richard mourned Ned's death as his own life continued to spiral out of control. Shortly thereafter, the new Hobgoblin started attacking the Rose, murdering his top lieutenants, Johnston and Varley. Meanwhile, Alfredo was checking the Hobgoblin's old lairs for anything that could incriminate Richard. He was discovered by Macendale, leading to a conflict, and Richard believed that Alfredo was killed as well. Distraught and seeking direction, he went to a church and confessed his sins. In the end, however, he ran back to his father and surrendered, offering to work for him. But then Alfredo turned up alive, reunited with Richard, and the two came up with a plan. Since Alfredo had more combat experience, he took Richard's place in the Kingpin's organization, even undergoing cosmetic surgery to alter his appearance. The phony Richard then enlisted the aid of an NYPD detective, Sergeant Bloom, who also had a vendetta against Wilson Fisk. Bloom's younger brother had been killed by the Kingpin's enforcers after refusing to accept a bribe, and so he became the new Rose. Alfredo threw himself completely into his new identity and even got engaged to a woman named Rebecca who fully believed that he was Richard Fisk. Funnily enough, she also had a white streak in her hair similar to Richard's mother, Vanessa. But as time went on, Alfredo became more and more unstable under the Kingpin's corrupting influence. He ended up forging an alliance with Macendale's Hobgoblin, putting him at odds with Sergeant Bloom. Bloom urged him to turn back from his dark path, but the phony Richard killed him in cold blood. With the second Rose dead, the real Richard Fisk reclaimed his mask for himself. While all that was going on, the Kingpin's war with Daredevil was going poorly, and soon he made one enemy too many. When he clashed with Hydra once again, the terrorist group drained his finances, launched an attack on his tower, and the Kingpin's empire began to crumble. While Wilson went underground, the phony Richard took over as the new Kingpin, even shaving his head due to a scar he'd received after being grazed by a bullet during a firefight. The real Richard adopted a more combat-ready costume, soon opposed the new Kingpin more directly, now calling himself the Blood Rose. Their battle ultimately ended when the Blood Rose shot the fake Fisk, who fell into the East River. However, Alfredo survived and was recovered by his men who intended on escaping to the Caribbean. But once there, their boat was caught in a storm and the imposter Richard was washed ashore following a shipwreck. There he encountered a man named Trench, who we'll give a little bit of explanation for. Dr. Kevin Trench was briefly a vigilante called Nightwatch, who wore a high-tech costume he received from an old time-traveling version of himself before he died. In his first outing, he attempted to stop a hijacking of a plane that he believed his girlfriend Ashley to be on, not knowing she'd changed flights. However, he botched the mission so badly that the plane went down, killing everyone on board. Ashamed and afraid, he exiled himself to an uncharted Caribbean island and vowed never to become Nightwatch again. Years later, Alfredo washed up on that same island, having lost an eye in the shipwreck. The two briefly became friends, but Alfredo soon found and stole one of Nightwatch's power gloves and dubbed himself Gauntlet. Knocking Trench out and stealing his boat, Gauntlet made his way back to New York, intending on getting revenge on the Blood Rose. In the meantime, the real Richard, as Blood Rose, continued waging war on the remnants of his father's organization. Naturally, the whole situation culminated in a big battle involving Gauntlet, the Blood Rose, Spider-Man, Nightwatch, and even a few others. In the end, Spider-Man defeated the Blood Rose and was shocked to discover that he was Richard Fisk. Meanwhile, Nightwatch defeated Gauntlet and reclaimed his power glove. Alfredo was sent to jail, but Richard cooperated with the authorities and entered witness protection. After that, the Rose identity was briefly used by a struggling reporter named Jacob Conover. He received the Rose's mask and territory from Don Fortunato, an aging mobster with ties to Hydra who owed Conover a favor. That Rose clashed with Spider-Man a few times, but was eventually defeated and has been rotting in jail ever since. As for Richard, he fell into obscurity, eventually turning to alcohol after his father regained his position as the Kingpin of crime. Feeling defeated and without purpose, he drifted back into his father's influence and encountered his childhood friend, Sammy Silk. Charismatic and ambitious, Silk convinced Richard and several of Fisk's lieutenants to join him in a coup against the Kingpin. Wilson had recently been blinded by his adopted daughter, Maya Lopez, after she'd learned that he'd killed her real father. Richard and the others took this opportunity to gang up on the Kingpin and repeatedly stab him. They believed they'd finished him for good, but Wilson Fisk survived yet again. Furthermore, his wife Vanessa had fully recovered by this point and returned to New York after the stabbing. While she sent men to deal with the other traitorous lieutenants, Vanessa confronted Richard herself. He claimed they were finally free, but Vanessa called him a disappointment and killed him in cold blood. However, before his death, Richard discovered a secret that his father had been keeping: the true identity of Daredevil. He passed that information on to Sammy Silk, and while the other would-be assassins were killed, Sammy passed it on to the FBI in exchange for protection. And so ultimately it was because of Richard that Daredevil's real name of Matt Murdock made the headlines, but that's a whole other story, and he eventually dodged those allegations. In the meantime, Vanessa started dying, and while her doctors could not determine what was wrong with her, she attributed her condition to the fact that she'd killed her own son. And so Wilson Fisk eventually recovered, but a regretful Vanessa passed away. Sometime later, the Rose identity would be adopted by yet another man, Dr. Philip Hayes. His schemes involved the development and distribution of a potent street drug using sweat glands from a mind-controlling supervillain known as the Corruptor. However, he was thwarted by Spider-Man and another masked superhero, Jackpot. Hayes later clashed with the living vampire Morbius and was killed as a result. More recently, the Kingpin embarked on a quest to obtain an ancient artifact known as the Lifeline Tablet, and as a result gained an opportunity to resurrect one person from the dead. However, he came to realize that Vanessa was at peace and would never forgive him if he used the power on her. Instead, he took this opportunity to undo Vanessa's greatest regret and fulfill her dying wish. Out of loyalty for him, Vanessa killed their son, and so out of love for her, Wilson brought him back. And so Richard Fisk rose again. But that's all I've got for you guys this week, so if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. I also stream on Twitch, and on Sunday this weekend I'm going to be playing the Like a Dragon / Yakuza series for the very first time with Yakuza 0. But like I said, that's all I've got for you guys this week, so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!